Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Summer didn't slam the door when she returned to the extension, but the quiet way it closed behind her was ever louder than any explosion, because she wasn't the same woman who had stormed out hours before. She came back fortified with verity, the DNA results gripped so tightly in her hand that the paper was formerly crinkled and damp from her sweat, and from the alternate Phyllis looked up and saw her son's face. She knew the game was over, because this wasn't dubitation or paranoia. Or another Summer's family misreading, this was evidence, cold and clinical and unrecoverable, and Summer didn't desolate time with amenities or defenses as she crossed the room, dropped the envelope on the table between them, and demanded to know how long Phyllis had planned on lying to her about the most abecedarian verity of her actuality, her voice shaking not with query but with slightly subdued fury as she said she had the results, she had the evidence, and she was done being gaslit by half-answers and diversions. Phyllis tried to smile at first, tried to reach for her usual armor of competence and defiance, but it cracked nearly incontinently under the weight of Summer's regard, because there was nowhere left to hide, and when Summer asked her point-blank why the man she'd grown up believing was her father didn't match the DNA profile, why everything she allowed she knew about her identity had just collapsed, Phyllis's bravado eventually dissolved into commodity raw and alarmed, and she admitted in a low, breaking voice that she'd always known this day might come, that she'd always stressed it, but she no way allowed Summer would find out this way, not through a lab report that stripped down all her precisely constructed falsehoods. Summer didn't sit down, didn't soften, didn't give her mama the grace of easing into the verity. She demanded names, timelines, reasons, demanded to know who her natural father really was and why. Phyllis had stolen that knowledge from her for her entire life, and that was the moment Phyllis closed her eyes, gobbled sprucely, and eventually confessed that the man Summer allowed was her father was no way her natural parent at each, that the real verity was messier, darker, and tied to a chapter of Phyllis's life she had buried because she believed she was guarding her son, indeed if that protection came wrapped in deception. When Phyllis eventually said the name, still at first as if hysterical the walls themselves would judge her, it felt like the bottom shifted beneath Summer's bases, because the identity of her natural father wasn't just shocking, it was explosive, a disclosure that rewrote her entire history and connected her by blood to a heritage she no way imagined was hers, and Summer's breath hitched as the counter-accusations slammed into her, all at formerly the connections she directed, the battles she'd fought, the alliances she'd trusted, were suddenly reframed through a lens she no way asked for, no way acceded to, and clearly no way wanted delivered like a ticking time lemon. She demanded to know how Phyllis could look her in the eye for times, could let her form opinions, make life choices, indeed marry and disjoin and fight wars in Genoa City, all while hiding commodity this enormous, and Phyllis, gashes streaming now, claimed she did it out of love, that the man in question came with peril, power, and consequences that could have swallowed Summer total, that she induced herself ignorance was mercy, that as long as Summer believed a simpler story, she'd be safe. But Summer laughed plaintively at that, pointing to the DNA results and saying this was the price of Phyllis's so-called protection, that rather of trusting her son with the verity, Phyllis decided she knew stylish and burgled her of the right to understand who she really was. The battle entwined snappily, with Summer criminating Phyllis of using falsehoods as a control medium, of shaping her life like a chessboard to suit her own fears and intentions, while Phyllis fired back that everything she did was to keep Summer from being pulled into a world of manipulation and blood feuds, a world where last names carried power and targets along with them. But Summer wasn't having it, because to her, the damage was formerly done, the verity didn't feel like protection, it felt like treason, and the fact that she had to uncover it herself through DNA testing made it indeed worse. She demanded to know if anyone differently knew, if this secret had been participated in. Whispers behind her reverse while she stood unconscious in the room, and Phyllis dithered just long enough to answer the question without words, which transferred Summer reeling as she realized this wasn't just a taradiddle of elision, it was a precisely maintained conspiracy of silence. As feelings reached a breaking point, Summer brazened her mama with the hardest question of all, whether Phyllis ever intended to tell her, or if she planned to take the verity to her grave. And Phyllis's incapability to give a clear answer was ruinous, because it verified what Summer formerly suspected, that this wasn't about timing or readiness, it was about control, about Phyllis deciding she alone could mandate the narrative of Summer's life, the fallout was immediate and brutal, with Summer declaring that she demanded space, that she couldn't indeed look at her mama without seeing times of manipulation concentrated beneath every memory, every I love you, every consolation that now felt tainted by deception. And when Phyllis prayed her not to walk down, claimed they could work through this, Summer snapped that this wasn't commodity you worked through like a bad argument, this was identity, this was blood. This was the verity about where she came from and why certain doors in Genoa City always sounded to open or slam shut, in her face. As Summer turned to leave, she made it clear that this disclosure didn't just change how she saw her mama, it changed how she saw herself, and she wasn't sure who she was presently, only that the woman who raised her had just shattered the foundation of her world. Left alone, Phyllis collapsed onto the settee, blubbing as the weight of her concession crushed her, knowing that no quantum of defense could undo what she'd done. And that by trying to shield her son from the verity, she may have permanently destroyed the one relationship she swore she'd cover at all costs. While away, Summer stood in the hallway gripping the DNA results like a verdict, realizing that her future, and her place in Genoa City, had just been irrevocably altered. Because formerly maternity is exposed, there's no going back, only fallout, consequences, and a reckoning that will ripple through every corner of her life, leaving no relationship untouched and no secret safe. Summer didn't make it to the elevator before the weight of the disclosure eventually crushed the air from her lungs, and she had to brace herself against the cool marble wall as images from her entire life replayed in jagged, disordered flashes, every argument she'd ever had, every inexplainable pull toward certain people, every instinct she'd dismissed as coexistence now screaming for acknowledgement, and the consummation that her blood tied her to a heritage far more important and dangerous than she'd ever imagined made her stomach twist, because this wasn't just about who her natural father was, it was about the ripple effect that verity would unleash across Genoa City, a megacity that thrived on secrets until they exploded, and Summer knew with nipping certainty that this bone would not stay contained for long. By the time she reached her auto, her phone was formally buzzing. Dispatches mounting up from people who tasted commodity had shifted indeed if they didn't yet know why, and she ignored every single bone, because the last thing she could handle was anyone differently trying to define this moment for her when she didn't indeed fade herself presently, her reflection in the rearview glass looking like a foreigner with familiar eyes that now carried the weight of a lineage she no way asked for. Meanwhile, back in the extension, Phyllis sat firmed in the fate of her concession, replaying the sound of her son's voice cracking as she read the DNA results audibly, because no matter how numerous times she'd rehearsed this agony in her head, nothing prepared her for the look of treason that cut deeper than any blameworthiness, and for the first time, Phyllis had to defy the intimidating possibility that her instincts so frequently sharp, so frequently justified had failed her in the one place she couldn't go to be wrong. She told herself she'd defended Summer, that keeping the verity hidden had spared her from manipulation and peril, but that argument chimed concave now that the verity was out and the damage unrecoverable, because protection erected on falsehoods always came with an expiration date, and hers had just run out. As hours passed, Summer drove erratically through Genoa City, recollections of her nonage ringing into commodity darker as she questioned every moment that now felt offered, every time Phyllis had diverted her curiosity or shut down a line of questioning with wrathfulness or gashes, tactics Summer formerly chalked up to overprotectiveness but now honored as strategic deviation. And the more she allowed about it, the clearer it came that this secret hadn't just shaped her history, it had laboriously steered her future, impacting her alliances, her romantic choices, indeed her professional intentions in ways she was only beginning to understand. When she eventually stopped the auto, it was instinct that guided her, pulling her toward a place tied not to console but to answers, because if her mama had prevaricated to her for decades, also silence was no longer an option. And Summer realized that defying the verity meant defying the man whose DNA now defined half of who she was, whether she liked it or not. Word of the DNA test spread briskly than anyone anticipated, whispers snaking through boardrooms and living apartments likewise, because secrets in Genoa City had a way of oohing through the cracks, and before Phyllis could indeed essay damage control, she started getting calls, some concerned, some accusatory, some dangerously curious, all circling the same implied question about what this disclosure meant for the balance of power that had been precisely maintained for times. Phyllis ignored them too, eventually understanding that this was an extremity she could spin her way out of. Because no quantum of strategic maneuvering could undo the fact that Summer now knew the Verity and was free to do with it whatever she chose, and that alarmed Phyllis further than any adversary ever had, because the one person she couldn't go to lose was slipping out of her reach. As night fell, Summer eventually stopped running from the Verity long enough to sit with it, and that was when the wrathfulness surged back stronger than ahead, not just toward Phyllis but toward everyone who had served from her ignorance, because she could now see how her identity had been curated to keep her useful but oblivious, strong but not too important, involved but no way completely initiated into the inner circles where pedigrees signified, and the treason burned hottest when she realized how frequently she'd defended her mama to others, how numerous times she'd stood between Phyllis and combination, believing that honesty was the one thing they always participated. The coming morning brought no clarity, only resolve, and Summer woke up knowing that pretending this disclosure didn't live was no longer an option, because the DNA results weren't just paper, they were proof that her life had been a precisely edited interpretation of the Verity, and she refused to continue playing a part in someone differently's narrative. She returned to the extension not for conciliation but for chancing Phyllis formerly braced for impact, eyes red from an insomniac night, and when their gapes locked, there was no warmth left, only the raw understanding that commodity abecedarian between them had broken. Summer told her mama she wasn't there to scream or cry, because those feelings had formerly burned themselves out, leaving behind commodity colder and more dangerous clarity, and she made it sorrowfully clear that while she wasn't cutting Phyllis out of her life fully, their relationship would no way be the same, because trust formerly shattered didn't magically assemble itself just because the Verity was eventually spoken. She advised Phyllis that the fallout from this secret was only beginning, that people would ask questions, lines would be redrawn, and commitment would be tested, and Phyllis would have to live with the fact that she lit the fuse by choosing deception over honesty. As Summer walked down for the alternate time, her way were steadier, her resoluteness sharper, because she understood now that knowing the Verity, indeed bone that shattered her world, gave her power, and for the first time in her life, that power belonged solely to her. Across Genoa City, the counter-accusations of Summer's maternity began to ripple outward, hanging old alliances and rejuvenating buried grievances, because pedigrees in this city were no way just particular, they were political, and the disclosure of who Summer truly was by birth promised to rewrite the rules for everyone involved. Alone formerly more, Phyllis goggled at the empty room and eventually allowed herself to admit the cost of her choices, realizing too late that by hiding the Verity, she hadn't defended her son from pain, she'd only laid over it, multiplying its impact until it came commodity neither of them could escape, and as she rumored and reasoned to no bone in particular, the silence answered back with a Verity she could no longer deny. Secrets don't just destroy adversaries in Genoa City, they destroy families, and this bone had only just begun to claim its casualties. The days that followed unfolded like slow-moving foreshocks, each one rattling Summer in new and unanticipated ways, because now that the Verity was out, it refused to stay neatly contained within her private grief, rather bleeding into every corner of her life until there was no place left where she could pretend nothing had changed, and far and wide she went. She felt eyes moping just a beat too long, exchanges stopping mid-sentence when she entered a room, the implied mindfulness that commodity seismic had happened. Indeed, if the details weren't yet public knowledge, Summer set up herself questioning her own responses, swinging between fury and numb detachment, because part of her wanted to scream the Verity from the rooftops just to recapture control of the narrative, while another part wanted to bury it deep and cover herself from the avalanche of opinions, prospects, and manipulations that would inescapably follow. Formerly her natural father's identity came common knowledge, and that internal war left her exhausted in a way she'd no way endured before. Meanwhile, Phyllis was fighting her own battle, scrabbling to anticipate the damage while knowing sharp well she no longer held the arm, because every instinct she had screamed to get ahead of the story, to shape it before others could weaponize it, but this time the story didn't belong to her, and that consummation was both humbling and intimidating, forcing her to defy a Verity she'd avoided for times, that her need to control issues had bring her the veritably trust she claimed to cover. When Summer eventually began taking calls again, the exchanges were careful, enciphered, people dancing around the egregious because no bone wanted to be the first to say the words out loud, and with each commerce, Summer came more apprehensive of how important power her silence held, because information was currency in Genoa City, and right now she held a secret that could shift alliances, destabilize conglomerates, and revitalize grievances long allowed buried. She tested that power cautiously at first, revealing nothing, hearkening further than she spoke, listing responses and connections, and in doing so she began to understand just how deeply her maternity was intertwined with the megacity's implied scale, because it wasn't just about who her father was, it was about what that name represented: plutocrat, influence, adversaries, history, and how her blood now placed her at the center of conflicts she'd formerly observed from a safe distance. The more she learned, the further wrathfulness coddled beneath her countenance, because it came sorrowfully clear that Phyllis hadn't only hidden a man from her, she'd hidden an entire heritage of verity, both palpable and impalpable. And Summer couldn't help but wonder who she might have come if she'd grown up knowing the full compass of her identity rather of a precisely sanitized interpretation designed to keep her just outside the most dangerous circles. Ultimately, avoidance gave way to ineluctability, and Summer realized that if she didn't defy her natural father on her own terms, someone differently would force that meeting for their own gain, so she made the decision still, designedly, without telling Phyllis or anyone differently, because this was commodity she demanded to do alone, a reclaiming of agency that had been denied to her for far too long. The meeting itself was nothing like she'd imagined, stripped of psychodrama but heavy with implied history, the air thick with recognition and restraint as two people faced each other bound by blood but separated by decades of falsehoods, and as Summer heeded to his interpretation of the once fractured, protective, pigmented with remorse, she felt a strange blend of confirmation and desolation, because hearing the verity from another source verified Phyllis's concession while contemporaneously exposing new layers of deception, deletions that suggested this secret had been accessible for further than one person. Not just her mama. She didn't forgive him, not also, because remission felt unseasonable and unearned, but she did leave with a clearer understanding of herself, of the traits she'd always claimed as her own now imaged back at her in unsettling ways. And that recognition was both grounding and destabilizing, because it forced her to accept that nature had played a part in shaping her just as important as nurture, no matter how important she defied that idea. When word of the meeting inescapably blurted, the response was nippy and unpredictable, enterprise running rampant as people rushed to position themselves on what they assumed would be the winning side of this arising power shift, and Summer watched it all with a growing sense of detachment, because the chaos unfolding around her only corroborated how transactional verity could be in this city, how snappily particular pain came public influence. Phyllis brazened her when she set up out, wrathfulness and fear colliding as she indicted Summer of walking into peril without protection, and Summer fired back that she'd been navigating peril her entire life without the benefit of honesty, that Phyllis didn't get to mandate the rules presently now that the verity was eventually out, and that battle ended not with screaming but with a cold understanding that their places had shifted irrevocably, Mama no longer the mastermind, son no longer the pawn. As weeks passed, Summer began to rebuild her sense of tone piece by piece, reconsidering her boundaries, reassessing connections, and making opinions that reflected who she was now rather than who she'd been raised to be. And while the process was painful, it also brought an unanticipated sense of emancipation, because for the first time she wasn't replying to an interpretation of reality curated by someone differently, she was choosing her own path with eyes wide open. Phyllis watched this metamorphosis with an admixture of pride and heartache, fading the strength in her son that she'd always believed was but now seeing it applied singly of her influence, and that forced Phyllis to defy her own emptiness, the void left before when control was stripped down and all that remained was responsibility. The final fracture came not in a dramatic battle but in a quiet discussion where Summer made it clear that while she still loved her mama, love was no longer synonymous with eyeless fidelity, that trust would have to be rebuilt sluggishly, if at each, and that Phyllis demanded to accept the consequences of her choices rather than framing them as offerings made in the name of fatherhood. That moment dallied long after Summer walked down, because it marked the true end of an period, not just for their relationship but for the vision that secrets could be buried indefinitely without consequence. As Genoa City acclimated to the new reality, alliances shifted, power structures creaked under the strain, and whispers of unborn battles began to circulate, all tied back to the simple, ruinous verity revealed by a DNA test, and through it all Summer stood at the center, no longer the son defined by someone additional story but a woman forged in The fate of disclosure, determined to claim every part of her identity indeed if it meant standing alone, and as she looked toward an uncertain future shaped by blood, choice, and hard-won clarity, one thing was inarguable: nothing in her life would ever be simple again, because formerly maternity is exposed and verity is unleashed. There's no returning to the comfort of falsehoods, only the long, painful, and eventually empowering trip of living genuinely in a world erected on secrets.